think your manager would appreciate
I don't
it.
appreciate your ruse, ma'am.
I beg your pardon?
Your ruse, your cunning attempt to trick me.
Welcome back to Growing Up Punk, the podcast about punk rock and all of its friends. My name is David. We got another interview lined up for you this episode with a guy by the name of Eric Grubbs. I'm going to tell you a bit about him in a minute here, but I did want to get some, housekeeping out of the way. Wherever you're listening to the podcast, make sure you rate it, you review, you subscribe, all of that good stuff. And of course, you can find the show wherever. So if you're listening to it and you're not on your preferred podcast app, why not find your preferred podcast app and find us on it? Simple as that. If you want to find us on social media, we're there as well. Instagram, Twitter, @GrowingPunkPod. You'll find mine and Aaron's personal Instagram and Twitter's linked there as well. We're on Facebook, and you can find us on our website, growingpunkpod.com. We've got, the episodes are there, as well as different blog posts, reviews, stuff like that. And we're on YouTube as well. So we're literally everywhere you can find us, and make sure you do find us, because each kind of place has different stuff going on. If you're listening to the show on YouTube, you're missing out on a lot because you don't get all the fantastic music that's included. But at the same point, on our YouTube channel, we've started to do video reviews, just discussing different things that we don't necessarily cover on the show. And as I mentioned, the blogs at growingpunkpod.com. So, today's episode, I am interviewing, or I should say I had the chance to interview Eric Grubbs. Now, Eric is an author. He wrote a book called Post, a look at the influence of post-hardcore, 1985 to 2007. So we talk about the book, we talk about, how he got into punk rock, how he got into post-hardcore, that kind of stuff. We even cover, why he decided to write the book in the first place, because he's not the first one, kind of to do so. And we get into talking about some of his favorite bands, both now and then, and towards the end of the episode, we also cover the album Can I Say by Dag Nasty. We discuss it for a few minutes, and that's brought in because I said, hey, pick an album from the book, Post, that you wrote, that you want to talk about. And so that's what he came up with, Can I Say by Dag Nasty. So, without wasting any more of your time, let's get into my interview with Eric Grubbs. Yeah, on the show this week, we've got a guest. This is kind of funny, because this sort of came up real quick for me. Your name's, I'm introducing you to yourself, I just realized. We got Eric Grubbs on the show. Now, if you're sitting there going, okay, I've kind of maybe heard the name here or there, it's because I've been Instagramming and tweeting a ton, because you wrote a book that I could not put down. That book is called Post, a look at the influence of post-hardcore from 1985 to 2007. So let's, I guess, Eric, first off, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, man. This is a lot of fun.
So I guess for me, my introduction to you was actually you showed up on Jimmy Eat Pod. And I can't remember for the life of me which song it was, though, but I was like, they mentioned the book, obviously. So this is our crossover. We've both guested on Jimmy Eat Pod. So which song was yours? Which one did you get to talk about?
It was Splat Out of Luck from the first record.
Right.
Or if you want to get really technical about it, it's the first self-titled Jimmy Eat World release.
Right. Yeah.
So this is the record that was put out on Wood and Blue, and Justin asked me if I wanted to talk about that, and I'm like, well, there's not a lot to talk about that record, but I'd be happy to talk about my Jimmy Eat World fandom, and I'd love to be back on that podcast, because what those guys do is really fun, and what you guys do is really fun, because it's like when y'all have done previous episodes about Good Riddance, and I'm like, okay, this is the kind of show that's right up my alley, because even though I'm kind of known as I'm known more for talking ad nauseum about post-hardcore and emo, I wouldn't have gotten into that music if it weren't for pop punk in the 90s.
Yeah. Yeah,
So-
no, it's I'd probably put myself sort of in the same boat. And I was going to say the song that I guested on was on Jimmy Eat World's other self-titled album, which of course is probably better known as Bleed American. But
Right.
I got to do If You Don't, which was fun. But yeah, no,
Love that
that's
song.
That's a great show. If you're listening to this show and you haven't listened to Jimmy Eat Pod, go do it. Even if you're not a fan of Jimmy Eat World, David and Justin are good guys. They're a lot of fun to listen
Yeah.
to. So
Yeah, they talk about a lot of things other than Jimmy Eat World.
yeah, exactly. Right? You can't. It'd be very difficult to do a podcast like that and just stay on topic the whole time. It would get a little tiring after a while, I think. But
Right.
so yeah, that was my introduction to you and your work with your book Post, which we're going to talk about the book a little bit.
Sure.
We're also gonna talk about a record that kind of comes from that too. But first, I wanted to ask. You kind of mentioned a little bit there with getting into the post-hardcore world, via pop punk, that sort of thing. So, what was kind of your first exposure that you can remember to the world of punk rock? Because we call the show "Growing Up Punk," which is funny in the sense that we had one guy at one point send us a message. He's like, you need to change the name of the podcast to like Growing Up Mall Punk or something like that, or at least like cover real punk bands or legit pop punk albums. And I was like, okay, that's sort of the funny thing I remember from growing up in a punk scene is like the gatekeeper sort of thing, right? And so yeah, I just kind of laugh at that, but I want to know how you kind of got into this world in the first place.
Sure. I first heard about punk rock through the fact that I was really invested in skateboarding for a number of years.
Yeah.
I mean, I was born in New Orleans, and I was born in 79, and my family moved in the summer of 87. And roughly from like 85 until about 89, I was really into skateboarding. And I had a friend at school when we still lived in New Orleans, that he liked to collect Thrasher magazine and skateboarding magazine. And so he would give me these copies, and I would see these advertisements for punk, hardcore, metal bands that clearly were not on the radio or television. And I remember seeing a one-page ad for Suicidal Tendencies' Join the War and being kind of freaked out by that. So I was aware that there was this thing called punk rock, and I believe one of the first records that I ever got as a kid was Chipmunk's Punk, which
Amazing.
if you the punk historians can be like, that's not punk rock. Well, it's essentially like the punk rock aesthetic filtered in through new wave and all that. And it's just like it's just for kids.
Yeah, I may actually have that in the room I'm sitting in right now. I found it at a thrift store one day and went, this is amazing. I just can't remember if I still have it. I have a stack of records. I've made note of this before. I record literally in a storage room, which you can probably see on your video chat. So like just up to my right here, there's a stack of records that are just kind of like the ones where I'm like, I just have them because I've come across them or whatever. And when I kind of start running out of room on my shelves, I sort of like reorganize. And anyways, I think it's possibly in that stack, which is hilarious that you brought it up, because it's the only time I've seen it or heard it was when I found it at a Value Village, and here you are. You're like, that's what got me into punk rock, man.
Well, I mean, like I'm very much of my age, of the fact that I watched MTV. I'm not exaggerating. I watched MTV every single day, almost every single day, from the summer of 1987 until the summer of 1998. And if I wasn't not watching MTV, I was watching a few other channels, but VH1 was another one. And so I watched it so much that practically anything that was on MTV I would get into. And that included starting with alternative rock, grunge, metal, and that easily segued at the time to me to like, well, if you like Nirvana, but say you're not so depressed, and Kurt Cobain kills himself. I mean, in early 1994, it's not a surprise that only a few months later, MTV started playing Green Day videos and Offspring videos, and really that kind of stuff I mean, I was into pop punk. Bad Religion, Stranger Than Fiction was something that I had a dubbed cassette copy of. I really got into Face to Face. They're still one of my all-time favorite bands.
Sure.
Basically, if you were on MTV on a regular basis and you were a pop punk band, I knew about you. But I would say that there was a major turning point that happened for me when I newly graduated high school in 1997. It was the summer of 1997, and my band played this day-long festival at the local Young Life, because we didn't have venues that you could play. It was either garages in Kingwood. We're talking suburban Houston here. In Kingwood, and so you had just really the option to play at the Young Life or Battle of the Bands at the high school.
Yeah.
And my band was not good enough to play at Battle of the Bands or the talent show, but we got to play at the Young Life. And so my band was playing really late into the night, but I got there early, and I was watching this band that I did not find out who their name was until today, because I actually messaged one of the band members, like, what was the name of that band that you guys did? And it was Dread Pirate Wesley. And, well, this band was made up of guys that I kind of knew, and they were a little bit older than me, and they played this wild mix of covers, and like they covered Chris Isaak's Wicked Game, and they did it like as close to the original as possible.
Right.
But then they said, like, okay, we're about to play an old school pop punk song. This is by a band called Bad Religion. It goes like this. And it was the song Sometimes I Feel Like from No Control. And I'm standing there off the side of the stage, and I just go ballistic. Like, I start like gyrating and going crazy. And I mean, it's not too dissimilar from like what you've seen in those hilarious videos of like Benny Hinn or Robert Tilton, of people that feel like the Lord, going through them and all that. But this was the real thing. And so I decided right then and there, I need more pop punk in my life. And that's where I was like, I don't want just the CDs. I want compilations. I want split 7 inches with all these non-LP songs. And we were fortunate in Kingwood to have a locally run record store called Sound Disc. It was run by a couple of deadheads who knew like what teenagers wanted to buy.
Yeah.
And so like they were aware of like pop punk, hardcore, post-hardcore, emo, as well as like Metallica bootlegs. So this place was very much up my alley. And so like they ordered from the distributor Choke, and they got, if you wanted something, you just put it down, they ordered it for you, and 2 weeks later it showed up. So that's really how pop punk really hit me at the right time. And it wasn't, and I just made this conscious effort to not just like listen to the stuff that was on MTV. I was like wanting to track down Fearless Records, Off Time Records. God, I mean, it's like anything that was in that Fat Wreck Epitaph sort of style, I was all for it. And so eventually that led me to the record that we're going to be talking about on this episode. So,
which I love that you mentioned that you just like dove in head first. You're like, I don't just want, like, I want it all. I want to get the split 7 inches even, like the stuff that's not on your full length releases, which is pretty awesome, because I had a similar experience in the sense that I wasn't, that first band I heard that got me into punk was actually MXPX. And it's like the first time I heard there actually was a song Teenage Politics, I was all about, I wanted to buy every single MXPX album I could find, but not necessarily like, I didn't, that world of going, there's stuff that's not on these, at the time, I think there were 4 albums that they had out, but it's like, there's stuff outside of that. That world was not like nowhere in my, like my vocabulary sort of thing at that time. It was just like, here's their 4 albums. That's what it is. So that's pretty awesome that just right out of the gate, you're like, no, there's other stuff that I know exists that I got to find. So, So Bad Religion was kind of then that gateway drug for you could say.
Yeah. And then, like, many years later, I was fortunate to get hooked up with a free ticket to go see Bad Religion play at the House of Blues here in Dallas. And completely unbeknownst to me, I mean, I kind of lost track of Bad Religion after The Empire Strikes First. No disrespect to the band. It's just sometimes certain records really hit you, and other times other records don't. But here I am watching them play, and then in the middle of the set, they decide, yeah, we're going to play almost all of No Control, and they played Sometimes I Feel Like, and just that I didn't freak out like I did in '97, but it was like, oh my God, I'm seeing them play this. Yeah. And that's a great way of, like, there's something that I love about pop punk that it's kind of hard. It's been hard for me to explain to people that don't get pop punk why I think it's so special, because, like, I've always liked, like, very, very melodic music. I grew up on, like, the soft rock format, but then when you have those melodies, but then when you play them at a fast beat, it brings this, like, really strong charge out of me. And I remember being in college and being around kind of the hipster mentality, and playing pop punk that I thought was well worth being played on the college radio station. And these people were really into Radiohead and the Strokes and the Vines, bands that I liked as well, but they just had no desire to be open-minded about pop punk. Yeah. So it's just like, it's kind of frustrating, because, like, honestly, like, what kind of pushed me away from pop punk, as far as, like, trying to make more friends that were into pop punk, is that the conversations weren't about the music. It was all about, like, what label this band is on, and, oh my God, this band toured with this really popular band. Oh, well, we can't like this band anymore. I was like, what? Why, if the music's good? I mean, for example, I remember seeing the Voodoo Glow Skulls play at Fitzgerald's in Houston, and the Joy Killer opened, and the Joy Killer was fronted by Jack Grisham from TSOL. I happened to meet Jack before and after the show, and he was totally nice. And the Joy Killer had this, like, unapologetically, like, awesome melodic music. You know, they had a piano player. The guy's name, it's escaping me right now. It's Ronnie King, I think, who's played on a couple of Pennywise records. Like, Joy Killer is playing to a good audience, and then Jack Grisham says, yeah, we just got off tour with the Offspring, and there's this sea of middle fingers around me, and I'm like, what, huh? And so, like, what kind of pushed me away from diving even more deeper into pop punk was this kind of, like, elitism. It's like if you were a Screeching Weasel fan or a NoFX fan, if you were on an email discussion list, you had to act like either Ben Weasel or Fat Mike and just be like pricks to people, and like, I'm like, what in the hell? By the way, I've been fortunate to interview Fat Mike a couple of times. Couldn't have asked for a nicer interview. Just going to put that out there.
You go.
But anyway, I'm kind of rambling here. But it was just kind of like this whole thing about gatekeeping and just being shitty to people that are just, like, trying to get into this music. It was kind of a letdown. And I also noticed a major change that happened when Blink-182 became really popular. I think Blink-182 is a fantastic band, always has been. And so, and as I'm working on this next book, Blink-182 is going to be brought up a lot because they influenced a lot of bands. So in other words,
totally.
like, at the end of the day, pop punk is, like, a very, very important thing for me as far as growing up. At least
totally.
Trying to.
I was going to say, the funny thing is, because I can remember growing up in the scene, and bands like, you brought up Face to Face, and you brought up Good Riddance earlier and stuff like that. For whatever reason, the scene that I grew up in, those bands, and obviously, like, NoFX, Pennywise, those bands were all, they got the okay, right? Like they got the thumbs up. But then as soon as you went down the road of something like a Blink-182, who you mentioned, or kind of getting into the earlier 2000s, like Newfound Glory and stuff like that, I can remember like going to shows and there being this sort of, you know, the gatekeeper distinct divide sort of thing where it's like, oh no, those bands aren't punk. But I'm like, what makes these bands that are, you know, defining themselves as pop punk any less punk than the bands that are clearly pop punk, but they're just on your favorite labels, right? So it's just funny that I think, and maybe it's just that I've gotten older, so I've just kind of gotten away from that, but I think that's kind of gone for the most part. Like we were talking earlier about, you know, some gatekeepers, like, why don't you change the name to Growing Up Mall Punk sort of thing, right? But but yeah, it's just funny, like that was always a thing in the scene, was like whether it was punk or not.
Yeah, here's just kind of this, what is it, an inconvenient truth about the history of punk rock, is that the punk rock bands that are seen as like pioneers, two of the biggest ones were honestly put together no differently than how Menudo, BTS, New Edition were created, and I'm talking about the Sex Pistols and the Clash. This isn't some hot sports opinion here. This is documented truth. That Malcolm McLaren wanted to cash in on the youth culture in London, and London was a terrible place to be in. And so he forms this band called the Sex Pistols. He formed the band. Yeah. And then he has this friend, Bernie Rhodes, and they were like friendly rivals. And he's like, well, I want to form my own band. And that band was the Clash. So whenever I would see people, you know, be so gatekeeping, it's like, man, I'm all about the real punk rock. I'm like, yeah, they were singing about things that were actually going on, but they were put together by a manager.
They were also signed to major labels.
Yeah. I mean, like there's just so many discrepancies and double standards about the history of punk rock that at the end of the day, it's just, do you like the music or not?
Right, exactly. And that's really, I think, for me, what it just boiled down to, because I like there was a period of time where I, you know, quote unquote, stopped listening to pop punk and to punk rock or whatever, because I felt like part of it was, you mentioned growing up, part of it was like, oh, I felt like I'd grown out of that. But at the same point, there were years down the road where I was like, no, you know what? Like, that's still the music that I love. And whether that's, you know, the classic, like, if I talk to my dad, well, the music that he loves is what he listened to when he was a teenager and just out of high school sort of thing, right? Like, I think that's just the natural way of things for a lot of it. But at the same point, it's just realizing that, you know, even after all those years of going, is this band punk or not? In the end, I'm like, I just don't care. I just like the music. So I, you know, come back to it and you listen to it. And in your case, you write books about it. Go ahead. I just want to add this is that it seems like that's on the topic of people's minds when they're trying to figure out who they are. And I think when you come to a better understanding of who you are as an adult, that kind of stuff just doesn't matter. And you just kind of have to sit back and be all like, yeah, I'm really liking Bad Cop, you know, and I'm going to Fest and I don't have to worry about proving myself to anybody. So, exactly. I was just trying to find, because I wanted to transition into talking about your book, and you kind of alluded to you know, you're working on another one. But I was, because of you, I've been reading Our Band Could Be Your Life, which you cited as a major influence on you writing this book. And I was just trying to find the specific quote in the introduction, because literally Michael Azerrad in the introduction says, just write your own version of this book, sort of thing, right? Like, I might not cover some of the bands you want to talk about, so just go do it, which is also obviously very punk rock in its own thing. Like, just go, you don't got a favorite band, go be your own favorite band, sort of thing. But so outside of feeling, you know, like the influence of Our Band Could Be Your Life, and which I should say, I heard about this book a while ago, and it was just until recently that I finally bought it. because I was reading your book, and I think you mention it in the book, or for sure it's mentioned in one of the little quips or whatever. And I was at a local record shop, and the guy was like, we were talking about music. He's like, "Oh, you got to read this book. Our Band Could Be Your Life." And so from that point, at that point, I was like, well, I'll see if I can find it in the library, which I was never able to, right? And then so it just kind of back of the mind sort of thing. And then finally, when I got a hold of your book and was reading it, and it came up, I was like, I got it. So I looked it up and bought it, and it's a great read. If you haven't read it, I'm not done it yet, so I'm saying that ahead of finishing it. But I'm trusting the rest of the book.
Our Band Could Be Your Life is written in this way that's like, just like, it comes from the perspective of somebody that really lived through those like records. Like, he remembers seeing them. He remembers like anticipating a record coming in the mail. And Michael Azerrad also wrote "Come As You Are," the story of Nirvana, which is the only authorized book on Nirvana while Kurt was still alive. And there's all kinds of insights on it that it's a very pure kind of look at who Nirvana was. So, I mean, as somebody that I hated reading for pleasure in high school, because like the books that I had to read for my English class, they were just very difficult for me to ingest everything that my teachers wanted me to ingest. Like, not only know the plot, but also know the themes, the rising action, the foreshadowing. I was like, huh. But then I read... I'd actually read that really quickie book that's very forgettable, but it's called Never Fade Away. It was written and published less than 6 weeks after Kurt died.
Okay.
And so, like, don't try to find it. It's not a good book. It's really short. And I mean, it's all completely unauthorized. But that led me to Come As You Are, the story of Nirvana. And so, like... so I had heard about Our Band Could Be Your Life, and I read it, and I mean, it was very inspiring to me. And what was kind of the final push to get me to write post, getting my P's all in order, was that I was going through like a real rough patch, like right after college, just like trying to figure out what I'm doing with my life. I was working 7 days a week. 5 days out of the week, I was producing on an afternoon oldies show on an oldies radio station. And on the weekend, I would be working like 16 hours total of doing traffic reports. So music was kind of the only thing that was else going on in my life. Music's been a very, very important thing in my life. And I started hearing about how that there was this book called Nothing Feels Good, Punk Rock Teenagers and Emo by Andy Greenwald. Yes. I didn't hear nice things about it. And I was like, really? How bad is this? And so what ended up happening is that on March 1st, 2004, I was en route to my leasing office at the apartment complex that I lived in. And there were roofers that had been working on all the buildings on my complex. And they're just like throwing shingles off and, because most people were at work or at school or something. So they were just throwing piles of shingles everywhere in the courtyard. And so right as I think I'm in the clear, a big pile of shingles hits my head like that. And so like I would say it was like a hard slap. It wasn't, it just was bleeding a little bit, but it like dinged me and kind of dazed me. And the thing is that I dropped off my rent check and I kind of lost track of time. And I ended up going to work like a little bit earlier than I normally do. And I remember distinctly driving down the Dallas North Tollway southbound and exiting off at Wycliffe in what was then a toll plaza. It's now gone, but the toll plaza. And as I was driving down, I was just starting to think about how, like, man, when are things going to get better about the whole like world of post-hardcore emo? Apparently this Nothing Feels Good book is really, really bad. And so I'd say to myself, well, what if I tried to write a book about it in the vein of Our Band Could Be Your Life? And I was like, that's not a bad idea. And so then when I got to work and realized I was 30 minutes early, I messaged one of my best friends in the world still, and we play in a band. We played in a band in college. We now play in another band now named Nick Wright. And I messaged him, and I was like, Nick, I've got this crazy idea. What do you think of this? And he says, you're not crazy, and I'll help you put it out. Now, he ended up not not putting it out. I had to self-publish it. But he was the guy that in that right moment where like this is a really good idea that you should do, but when you have somebody that you trust to encourage you to do it, you go even further. And that day I reached out to members of Jawbox, whom I had already corresponded with because I was just like a really big fan of. And I also reached out to Adam Fowler from Jawbreaker, and they all said yes. And that began a period of just interviewing people either via email, phone, or in person. And that was a good 3 years. And when unfortunately I could not find a publisher that wanted to publish the book that I wanted out there, kind of a long story, but I ended up self-publishing it. And the fact that I am still talking about it 11 years later is honestly, it's a big, it's a nice reassurance that all along that I was like, I stuck to my guns about what I believed in, and that people still want to talk about it. I still get royalty statements. They're like laughably paltry compared to like, people that live off their royalties. But the fact that people still care, that means everything to me. And due to the fact that all the bands that I feature in Post, they were broken up at the time that when the book came out in 2008, 2009. It's been so long ago.
Right.
But I wanted to do an afterword, and no publisher wanted to publish a 10-year anniversary of Post. So I decided, well, why not I write a second book? I had a really good conversation with my wife the day after we got married in 2017. And she's like, well, what's the next big creative project that you want to do? We talked about doing a documentary about post-hardcore emo. But I decided to write a new book because I think a 5-page afterword just wouldn't do justice to all the bands that reunited, all the bands that went mainstream, and the emo revival. And so I've been working on that book since November. This new book, which I'm planning on calling Forever Got Shorter, I've been working on that since November of 2017. and it just, but the thing is that the longer that I work on it, the more like I interview people that I didn't think I would get to interview. So it's going to be another self-publishing affair, unless somebody really wants to help me out and not steal all my cut of it. But yeah, it's honestly been a very rewarding experience to do podcasts, interact with people that have questions about it. And I realize that I'm just blabbering here, and you probably want to ask some questions, so I'll shut up.
No, it's funny. I had a few things that came up while you're talking. One of which was, I was glad you brought up Jawbreaker, because you're wearing a pretty great shirt right now.
I'm actually wearing a Java Breaker shirt. It says Java Breaker. If you go to Donut Friend in Los Angeles, they have a donut flavor called Java Breaker. And so anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, well, no, I was going to say, where did it come from? Because the Java Breaker was somewhere in my brain. I was like, I know I've seen this somewhere, and I think that's people had posted about it on Instagram or whatever. But
it's a great donut shop owned by Mark Trombino, who worked with Jimmy World and Blink-182.
Yeah, that's so great. So were you always interested in writing, though, or was it just kind of like you're like, this is a void I'm going to fill?
No, I hated writing. Perfect.
That's a great place to start.
But what had happened was, when I went to college and I was a radio, TV, film major, writing scripts was a lot of fun to do. I was really into Kevin Smith, still am. And Kevin Smith, his wisdom actually brought me and my wife together. Long, fun story about that, but staying on track here, was that writing screenplays was fun. And then when in one of my classes, I decided to write about how at the time Family Guy was unfairly slagged off as a Simpsons clone. Right. I decided to write a paper about why Family Guy is not a Simpsons clone. And I had to really work and refine it. One of my roommates helped me write something that I could be proud of. And I realized then, if I'm writing about something that I genuinely care about, it easily flows out. And I've been told by people that have like read my like reviews or articles is that it's apparently really obvious when I'm super into something and when I'm not into something. And so when it comes to the books that I've written, there's Post, and then there's another book, When We Were the Kids, and then this next book, is that the enthusiasm, I hope, translates onto the page. And it's a big honor for me when people tell me, it's like, hey, I decided to check out all these bands that you wrote about because of your enthusiasm, because that's what happened to me. I didn't know much about the Replacements before Let It Be. I didn't really know much about Beat Happening, or Husker Du's back catalog. It's like, but because of the way that Michael Azerrad wrote about them, just made me like really interested in getting to know who these bands are.
Yeah. That's one of my favorite things about reading, because I find, like, whether it's fiction or even just a lot of times like biographies, autobiographies, whatever, the case may be, sometimes I can really get into it, but for the most part, I'm like, it's really got to catch me from the get-go. But books like Post and Our Band Could Be Your Life, half of the fun is going back and kind of discovering, or even rediscovering in some instances, like bands that are being discussed. The first time I can remember kind of doing that with a book was actually This Is a Call, which is the Dave Grohl biography, right? And
yes.
Yeah, and so like especially in the section of that book where they're talking about Dave's upbringing in the Washington D.C. scene, right? And so like that, I mean, it's incredible to me how many different books that actually gets covered in, which, I mean, says a lot, obviously, about what was happening there. Because not only do you cover it, it's also covered in Our Band Could Be Your Life. If I recall, it's covered. For sure, it's covered in Nothing Feels Good, and just like all these different books that mention it. And I was glad you brought up Nothing Feels Good, because my initial reaction to when I kind of read the description of what your book was, I was like, oh, is it just going to be like reading Nothing Feels Good, kind of 2.0? Because like that book had some nuggets, right? Like it had some interesting parts where I was kind of like, okay, but it also felt very, I don't know how to explain, especially maybe like the Dashboard Confessional, sort of the Chris Carrabba stuff felt very over the top and almost cartoonish in a sense in how it was like describing all this stuff. And then the whole back end of the book about Makeout Club and stuff like that. I was like, why is this a thing that I'm reading about? But your book is definitely not Nothing Feels Good 2.0. And I think a lot of that is, as you mentioned, kind of anchored in just sort of how you approached telling those stories and writing this book. So I guess that leads me to a question in, how much of this book were you kind of like legitimately sort of there for and going along with, like as it was unfolding? Because obviously you cover 1985 to 2007. That's 22 years. You obviously, I'm going to assume you weren't, there in the flesh for all of that.
That is correct. But my thing about, I mean, I've received some blowback of like, you really weren't there, Eric. This is the worst book ever. Actual comment on that I once saw. But when it comes right down to it, is that all writers have to do research in order for, in order to tell the best kind of story. And that means you got to interview a lot of people. And so I've never forgot what it was like to like be a fan of like when The Promise Ring was really active, when Sunny Day Real Estate was active. And I just tried to put that in there, but not start using first person. And so I talked to as many people as I possibly could. And just every kind of like little minutia I wanted to find out. Because, there's that infamous rant that Ian MacKaye goes off of at an Embrace show, which I believe was actually turned out to be the last Embrace show, where he's like, emo core is the stupidest fucking name I've ever heard. It's on YouTube. I, as somebody that read Thrasher, I was all like, okay, well, this makes sense that, being into skateboarding culture, Thrasher, it's kind of like this kind of stuff has always like been around, but in order for me to get things straight, I need to talk to as many people as possible. And it was very important for me to interview at least one band member per band that gets a chapter. I was very fortunate to not only interview Ian MacKaye, but also Brian Baker for the Discord chapter. And some chapters I got to interview every band member. Jawbox, Hot Water Music are the two. With Jimmy Eat World at the time, they were still riding off the success of Bleed American, but Zach Lind actually was very, very kind to me to take 30 minutes out of his pre-show time on the Futures tour to answer questions that I had for him. And I recently interviewed Zach for this new book, and he didn't remember interviewing with me, but when you do thousands of interviews, how the fuck are you going to remember all this? But I told him, I'm like, you were really nice to me, and you didn't have to be. But that's something that I've never forgotten. And so it's like, because of the fact that I was into the things that were a common thing to be brought up about, like, well, we were skating and I met this guy and we started playing a band. I'm like, I can relate to this. Mm-hmm. And to just kind of briefly bring it back to Nothing Feels Good, Punk Rock Teenagers and Emo. This is my polite way of saying something that if you get me really drunk, I'll just like rip into it. But this is my polite criticism of that book, is that it's very superficial, and it's clearly written by a guy that he says at the forefront, I'm an outsider to this, and he spends 6 weeks getting into emo culture. And there are a lot of typos in it. There are a lot of errors, and there's a lot of context that is really missing from that book. And so when I see so many people cite it as the definitive works, I'm like, I think there are some other books that are a little bit more informed. And my book was just an attempt to be more informed. I have nothing against Andy Greenwald. I don't know him. I've never talked to him. It's just when you write something so superficial, it kind of comes across. It's like the way that he presented post-hardcore emo is like it just kind of popped out of the sky one day. I'm like, no, it didn't just pop out of the sky one day. Yeah. And I also say this is that Chris Carrabba is a wonderful dude, and I tried to read Nothing Feels Good. And this is very emo-ish of me, but I got halfway through it and I threw the book across the room, and I went back to my computer and started working on it. Oh, funny. But I decided to try to read Nothing Feels Good after I made the decision that, okay, this is this book I'm going to write. But it's like, Andy is a published author and that wrote for Spin, and I think he currently writes for The Ringer. So he has legitimacy, right? But that book was written in such this superficial kind of way that I'm like, well, hey, I have no cred to my name, but at least I got to try, because I see all these people complain online. And it's like, well, why aren't you guys trying to do something about this? There are more people that are very, very more informed than me. Why aren't they writing books? Oh, I don't want to write it. I don't want to do that. So it's just kind of like, well, I at least want to try. And that's what I stress to people even now. It's like, if you don't like what you see, try to do something about it instead of just posting on Reddit about how this book sucks.
Yeah, which is interesting, because that's kind of a point that I had written down when we're going to talk about Dag Nasty in a little bit, but was just kind of I was listening to the One Life, One Chance podcast with Toby Morse. And
Toby.
Who was he interviewing? He was interviewing, actually, I think it was, oh no, it was the interview with, why can't I remember his name now? He took over for vocals in Dag Nasty. This was semi-recent that this interview happened. I had it written down. Anyways, I can't remember his name.
There was the original singer, Sean Brown, and then there was Dave Smalley. Then there was Peter Kortner. And then they reunited with Dave Smalley. And it was with Peter Kortner? Okay.
Yeah, and so it just, anyways, this has nothing to do with Peter, but Toby had made a comment where he said, I enjoyed punk, like that kind of like the first, sort of wave of punk rock or whatever. He's like, but I really had no idea what, anarchy in the UK meant and all that kind of stuff. He's like, so when I heard like hardcore punk for the first time, he said, not only like were these people like angry about something, he's like, that's what I took from, kind of like that first wave of punk, is like they were angry about something, but didn't necessarily want to step up and do anything about it, right? It was just like, fuck the world sort of thing, right? Whereas he found like with that 80s hardcore scene, like these kids that were writing songs were like, yeah, I might be angry about something, but I also want to do something about it. So it's just kind of an interesting tie where you say, like, if people are just get up, and if you complain about something, get up and do something about it, sort of thing.
H2O was a huge influence on me.
Oh man, and so good.
And Toby Morse, solid dude.
Yeah, for sure.
Dude.
It's funny because, like, I mean, you can, in a lot of ways, like Dave Grohl, going back to, we were talking about Dave earlier, I mean, he gets all the, like, obviously, like, oh, he just seems like the nicest dude in the rock and roll world, right? Like, that's just a huge band playing shows all over the world, while not playing shows all over the world right now, the way things are. But, it just seems like this legit dude. And I'm like, on a different level, I get that very same vibe with like Toby Morse of like the hardcore punk world. I'm like, that dude just seems like, you could hang out with him for hours on end, and he's just like super cool, super chill the whole time. Also, he has a ton of great guests on his podcast, which I've kind of slept on. Like when he first started it, I was like, oh, this is awesome. Cause I want to say he was starting it around the time that we were doing an episode on H2O back in the older life of the podcast before we lost a bunch of episodes. But anyway, and I was like, oh, this is going to be great. And then I just never listened to it. And then it was just recently I was going back through and I was like, dude has had a ton of great guests that I just want to sit and listen to. And he just talks to them real easy. So,
yeah. I mean, I had this one experience of a friend of mine from high school died of a drug overdose. And when I was in college, and the first show that I saw after he died was H2O, and playing at the Galaxy Club. And I walked up to him and I was like, dude, this show was like really, really good. A friend of mine just died of a drug overdose, and he has no idea who I am. But the fact that I just opened up to him, he just said, dude, I'm so sorry for your loss. And I'm really glad that, our performance, could uplift you. That's Toby Morse to me, You can just blow people off and be like, what the fuck do I care? Who are you?
Yeah.
But that sincerity, and the sincerity that he sang about, it really stems from like mid 80s Discord. It's like there are all those songs like Family Tree. So I was thinking about the good old times on all the people that helped me survive, and who the hell knows where I'd be if it weren't for a family tree. It's like, and I haven't listened to H2O in a long time, but it's like that's the kind of stuff that is like very firmly implanted in my brain about like it's not just being all like fuck Reagan. It's like, let's be kind to each other and let's be genuine and be good people to each other.
Yeah, and I mean, like, so he spoke about kind of like finding that in hardcore, and it's incredible that he's just, because I don't even know if we're gonna go down this rabbit trail or not, but just the fact that he just still lives that to this day. He's like 50 now, I think he just turned 50 this year, and so the fact that that's still very much kind of dictating who he is, that's pretty incredible to discover that as a teenager. And it legit, like, I mean, you can say like, oh, punk rock changed your life or whatever, and to a certain extent I'm like, yeah, I could say that about myself, but not to that level. Like, that's incredible.
And punk just keeps like changing its definition. I think Joe Escalante put it best in The Other F Word, that documentary that has like Jimmy Lindbergh in it and Art Alexakis from Everclear. And it's just like, what exactly is punk rock? What is it to be punk rock? Does it mean that you're living on the streets and you have like 3 illegitimate children and you're addicted to heroin? Is that the kind of life that you're supposed to have? Or are you supposed to, be an ethical, smart person? And I mean, punk rock is just very much about like, what I've always kind of taken it to be is all like, be who you want to be and be the best version of yourself. And, and to a certain degree, don't completely abandon your morals to only make a lot of money. Don't screw people over. Don't, do terrible things to people just because it's like because of greed. I mean, it's just like, so it's a much deeper sort of thing about whether or not you sound like the Damned's first record, or you sound like Gigi Allen, or you live like Gigi Allen.
Yeah.
And I find that for people to adjust as an adults, Milo Aukerman put it best in Punk Planet many, many years ago, was that you can't fight adulthood. And
Right.
I'm telling you, that's been a struggle in my life, but I actually really embrace and enjoy adulthood now much more at 41 than, say, when I was really struggling with it in my 20s.
Yeah. Going back to, you made the comment about, what is punk rock? Is it living on the street, being addicted to heroin, that sort of thing? The decline of Western civilization would have you believe that, yes, that is punk rock. Because of, I think it was maybe a tweet that you sent out.
I tweeted out yesterday. Yeah, I tweeted out about how DVDs are essentially, it looks like DVDs are going to stop being produced. And I bought the Blu-ray box set of the 3 Decline in Western Civilization movies a few years ago. And there was this one night, I was just like recently, where I was just thinking about something to watch. And they happen to have, like, I've always been meaning to watch the second one about the hair metal years. Yeah. And they have it on Amazon Prime. And I just didn't want to get up from the couch. I mean, we're talking like 10 feet away from me to go find the box set and put it into our DVD player. But I decided to not do that, and I watched the metal years. But it reminds me of, but getting back on track, is that, the first one is very much about like these runaway kids where like it was the California dream of like, you live in California, you're supposed to have this great life. And all these kids come from broken homes that they're just trying to find some sort of community. And it's really kind of sad, but I will say this. The Black Flag footage with Ron Reyes on vocals, incredible.
Yeah.
Absolutely incredible.
Yeah, so your tweet about that led me. I was like, oh, that's on Amazon Prime? So I opened it up, and I started watching part 1. I was like, oh, yeah, I saw this not that long ago. I remember watching it. And, like, the Black Flag footage is definitely what stood out for me from that. So then I was like looking, I was like, oh yeah, there's part 2 and 3, and I saw part 2 as like the metal years or whatever. I was like, maybe not tonight. And then part 3 being, in the 90s or whatever. And I'm like, okay, I want to check this out, because this would have been like when it was shot, because I think, was it released in 98? But anyway, it was around the time that I would have first been like really getting into punk. And I was like, okay, so what are we going to cover here? And I just watched it, and I was like, man, like, I don't know if I knew anybody that was like this. Now, obviously, like, from one scene to the next, things changed, and growing up in the Calgary scene in Alberta, Canada, is going to be very different than, I think that's Los Angeles, maybe, that part 3 is.
I think so. I have to say this. I've had part 3 on DVD all this time, but I've never watched it. I think it actually was unreleased until like the DVD box set came out, which was just crazy. But yeah, I mean, I hear you, because it's like, as I was getting into punk and hardcore, hearing about all these things happening in California and in New York. And for me, growing up in the South, first New Orleans and then Houston, all this stuff about people talking about, like, yeah, going to CBGBs and we're going to get you want to get into a fight in the pit? What you going to do about it, motherfucker? Yeah, where it's just all like, I'm like, whoa, huh? What?
So, I mean, yeah. In all fairness to the Decline part 3, it is specifically focused on like gutter punk sort of thing, right? Like homeless teenagers. Okay. So I'm like, yeah, I can't recall knowing any of those people. I am interested to look up, though. It says it was shot in 1998, which is crazy to look back on, because I'm like, oh yeah, that should feel somewhat, like, I mean, that's what, 20 plus years ago now. But I was like, just watching it, it's incredible how how much older it looks than 1998. But obviously, it also wasn't like a major motion picture or something like that.
Right.
I'm curious to know what happened to some of those people because they were all in 5 years I'll be dead. I'm like, I wonder if that actually happened or not. But and because of you though, tweeting about Amazon Prime and the decline being on there, I went and I was like, holy crap, there's a ton of good punk documentaries on here. So earlier today I was watching Salad Days in hopes that there would be a bit of information on Dag Nasty before we talked about them, but they're only a little snippet.
One thing real quick, David. My Pro Tools crapped out. I'm back recording now. But it actually stopped recording while you were talking. So this should be very easy to edit, but I'm recording now again. So anyway.
Okay. I'm going to leave it all in.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
I was just rambling on anyway, but maybe this will be a good, I did want to ask, two more things about your book one's about Post and then the other's about the upcoming Post. So you had mentioned, we were kind of messaging back and forth because obviously you'd sent the book to try and hopefully find some people to publish it, distribute it for you. And you kind of mentioned a funny little tidbit about, like, did you send a sample chapter, the Braid chapter, and you kind of got some interesting feedback on?
Yeah. So, I mean, I had originally thought, like, okay, I'm going to put this out on my friend's label. That didn't work out. Then I got in touch with an agent, and this guy is a very wonderful man who gets it. He's a musician himself. I have nothing bad to say about this agent, and he pitched it out to a few publishers, and one of them was St. Martin's Griffin, and I was not interested in working with St. Martin's Griffin because of the fact that they had published Nothing Feels Good, Punk Rock Teenagers and Emo.
Right.
And the editor there was like, I want to read some more. And so read the Braid chapter and said the Braid chapter was boring. And and what St. Martin's Griffin wanted was just essentially a book that kind of grouped all the bands together from the scenes that they came from. But as far as like the behind the scenes nitty gritty stuff, that was apparently boring. So I decided to walk away from a potential deal because I was like, I had pitched, at that point, I had interviewed and gained the trust of people that this was the book that was going to come out. And I didn't want to go back on my word. And so I passed on the opportunity, and that book eventually became Wish You Were Here, that Leslie Simon wrote. I'm not claiming that, I think St. Martin's Griffin just wanted this kind of book out there.
Right.
And they got Leslie Simon to write it. I mean, Leslie Simon had co-authored Everybody Hurts with Trevor Kelly, and that was a pretty successful book, which is as compared. Nothing Feels Good is the one book that I'm like, I have a hard time finding nice things to say. But Everybody Hurts is really funny because like Leslie and Trevor were very involved in their respective scenes, and it's very much obvious in what they wrote about, including the inside jokes in that book. But so the Braid chapter, which I thought was a very important turning point chapter, this editor thought it was boring. So I'm like, well, if you think that's boring, you're going to be bored by the whole book. So,
which is funny that they put out a book with a chapter all about Makeout Club, because I struggled. I was like, in Nothing Feels Good, I'm like, okay, I gotta finish the book because here I am. I've paid for it. I'm reading it, and that last chapter, I was just like, I got through it. But anyway, I did want to ask about. So, what did you say the title of the book you're working on now is?
It's the I can't find a better title. Let's just put it that way. And I've already approved it by Bob Nana from Braid. It's like I want to call it Forever Got Shorter, another look at the influence of post-hardcore, from 2009 to maybe 2020. I don't know. It's
depends
I'm
how
not
long
finished.
it takes you to write it.
It's very much like kind of like a sort of like wrap up of where things. Okay, I've got this starting point, and where's kind of like my stopping point as far as for things. So yeah.
Because that was, I mean, one of the things reading Post, like it's been out for a few years now, and obviously, you wrote
12
it over
years.
a couple of years. Yeah, it was, as you mentioned earlier, a number of the bands that you covered in here were broken up at the time, but then I think maybe the only ones that weren't were probably Hot Water Music, the Get Up Kids, and Jimmy Eat World. Maybe were At the Drive-In still together then?
At the Drive-In was broken up. And it didn't seem like they would ever reunite, given all the shit talking that Omar Rodriguez, then known as Omar Rodriguez, now Omar Rodriguez Lopez, talks shit about At the Drive-In. So when At the Drive-In reunites, and then they reunite again, this time without Jim Ward, I'm like, and they just stand there like statues and act like they have no passion into playing it. I can't help but wonder what's really going on here. So at the time, like Hot Water Music broke up like right as I was finishing the book. And so I was like, no. And then like the Get Up Kids were broken up, and it didn't seem like that band would ever reunite, given the fact of like how Jim Suptic, Ryan Pope, and Robbie Pope all had very frustrated feelings about Matt Pryor. Happy to say that they've reunited. Braid had done their first reunion tour, but that was kind of seen as like a one-off. And then when they reunited again a few years later, and then they did a No Coast, then it's kind of like, oh man, there's a lot more story. And also, I have to say this is that technically Fugazi never broke up.
Oh, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, like they adamantly said, like we've not broken up. Apparently, over the years, behind closed doors, the four of them have practiced together. But as far as them getting together and playing shows, I don't think that's ever going to happen.
Yeah.
But yeah. So technically, every band that I spotlighted has reunited in some form or fashion. Jawbreaker was in some ways I didn't think it would ever happen, but then again, when I saw Blake Schwarzenbach perform a solo show here in Dallas, and he mentioned that he had hung out with Chris Bauermeister for the first time in many years, I was like, I think Jawbreaker's going to get back together. So
it is funny though, because like some of those bands getting back together have released some like killer albums, like Braid. You mentioned No Coast, which I mean I hadn't. So my story with Braid is actually I was first a fan of Hey Mercedes, because they kind of obviously like the Vagrant years when Vagrant was kind of blowing up with the whole, like emo pop punk sound, and Hey Mercedes is there. Their album Loses Control we did an episode back when, COVID was first happening, and we actually did multiple episodes called The Quarantine Scene, where we got different artists to like recommend some, not necessarily their favorite records, but like underrated records sort of thing. And so like the one that I brought up for our episode, one of them was Hey Mercedes Loses Control, because every time I go back to it, I'm just infatuated. What it boils down to is Bob Nana's lyricism, really, I think, and his melodies and whatever that kind of comes to the forefront. But then so to go and listen to No Coast and hear kind of like Braid, but also very polished Braid, I was like, oh, this is so good for me. This is good for my soul. And then obviously you mentioned Get Up Kids getting back together, and their album Problems was one of my favorite albums from, was that just last year it came out?
Yeah, came out.
Yeah,
like polyvinyl.
That record caught me out of left field. It was so good. But,
oh yeah.
So the idea with the new book, are you going to kind of like, here's where we are, where we, picking up where you left off sort of thing, and then kind of touching on I know you mentioned some of like the emo revival bands and stuff like that. Do you want to like, do you want to tease any of those bands? Are you
sure.
Just kind of like, nah, we're going to keep it a surprise?
I mean, well, it's not going to be like how Post was, where one chapter is devoted to one band.
Okay, yeah.
I've decided that got to talk about it just kind of keeps developing, but it's like give sort of an update about everything that happened since Post came out, and that is talk about all the band reunions and how those went well. I had a lot of misgivings about mainstream emo when it was happening, because it just kind of seemed like people were way more interested in mainstream emo, and they didn't give a shit about kind of like where it came from.
Sure.
And well, how it's all panned out is that because of the emo revival and also because of, passionate fans, is that the mainstream and the underground DIY version, they very much, they complement each other. Where like I've interviewed people that started emo revival bands that love Blink-182 or Paramore or My Chemical Romance, to where I'm like, you know what? I need to reevaluate stuff about like My Chemical Romance and stuff like that. And I mean, I didn't outright hate that band. It's just I was like very disappointed that even now, when I bring up emo to somebody that say is just kind of a casual listener, I've been laughed at by people. That's it's like, hey, I wrote a book about where emo came from. I mean, I once told that to a room full of journalism students, and they all laughed at me. So, but anyway, so yeah, it's really what I'm trying to do is like talk about the reunions, really address and not sound like some bitter old man about the mainstream stuff, but also talk about the emo revival and just how it's impacted people all over the world.
Right.
So anyway, I'm babbling too much.
That's okay. Before we get into and going back in time, a bit of an older record, do you have a favorite or a couple of favorites, bands that would be dubbed as emo that are, or post-hardcore, whatever, that are kind of in the middle of their heyday now?
Tiny Moving Parts.
Hell yes.
Those guys are the real deal.
Man, I was gonna say every I'll put a record on. It doesn't matter which record it is really from them, because every one is good. And I tweeted one a while back. I was like, I think Tiny Moving Parts is my favorite band that I always forget about. And part of that is because, as I sort of mentioned earlier, I'm more inclined a lot of times to kind of like go back, right, and like listen to those favorite records from back whenever. But I also like to try to like be aware and into if like new stuff that's coming out. And so Tiny Moving Parts is just always this band that sneaks up on me to the point where I'm 100% those guys are if there's a real good chance that if someone were to ask me that very same question, Tiny Moving Parts would definitely be at the top of the list, just for current bands in general, not even like genre defined sort of thing.
Yeah, as far as other bands, there are many, many other bands. Unfortunately, a lot of these bands are short-lived. A great example would be Modern Baseball. Those guys, they were poised to be huge, but I think it's very, very good of them, and there's so much merit in taking care of your mental health. And so, like Bren, Jake, they just decided, you know what, we can't do this band anymore. And to just kind of explain like how big this band got was that when they were touring off of Holy Ghost, or they were about to tour on Holy Ghost, they were going to be playing the place in Dallas where Slayer plays. Yeah. They were that big. And I'm like,
yeah.
And only 2 years prior, they were playing, it was, for the longest time, it was known as the Gypsy Tea Room. Then it was known as the Prophet Bar. Nothing changed about the venue, just the name. But I remember seeing Modern Baseball when they were doing You're Gonna Miss It All. It was on that tour cycle. That place was packed. And so Modern Baseball does stuff. And there's bands that are going on now that are doing great stuff. I would highly recommend the band Dogleg. There are a lot of... they put out, I think they have a record out on Triple Crown Records. Lots of great emo bands out there. And it's just like Tiny Moving Parts, though, is a band that is consistently excellent. And I remember meeting them at a house venue in Denton. And they were just so happy-go-lucky, happy to be on tour and everything. Just wonderful dudes. And they're still that way. And now it's like Dylan is like this guitar hero to all these like younger people that want to learn, like, doing the alternate tunings and putting a capo on it and doing all this tapping stuff, which was just Dylan being inspired by Fall of Troy. And so you have all these younger people wanting to do the same thing. So, there's My Chemical Romance can headline arenas. That's great. And it makes a lot of people happy, including me. But there's also like Tiny Moving Parts can play smaller venues around here, and people are genuinely happy. So it's like, yeah, Tiny Moving Parts is definitely going to be a major player because of just their story alone. Is kind of crazy. So
going back to the Guitar Hero comment, I was saying I'm 35 years old, and Dylan got me wanting to learn how to, like two-hand tap and all this, like stuff I never did, and I was like, I'm going to learn Tiny Moving Parts songs, and then I do it, and I'm like, why am I doing this to myself? I can't handle this anymore.
When
I'm
like
too
he's
old
doing
for this.
he's doing those playthroughs on YouTube, and he's like,
Yep.
Ernie Ball and Fender are sponsoring him. I'm like, good on him, and he's still just the amount of positivity that radiates from that guy is incredible. But
he's having a good time all the time.
Yeah.
That's at least that's what it looks like. I guess I can't make that assumption, but he definitely, like, you can't help but smile when you see that guy play music. And those playthroughs, I'm like, I would like just even an instrumental Tiny Moving Parts record, because they're just like, song wise, they're just so good. And then I found that with some bands where I'm like, okay, musically this is really good, and then the vocals come in, I'm kind of like, okay, I can't quite get on board. Whereas like with Tiny Moving Parts, it's like both sides of that coin are right there. But
totally.
Let's before we go too terribly long, I said you got to pick one record that kind of like, and I kind of, now I don't know if this sort of hindered your choice at all, or what have you, but I said it's got to be from something that was at least briefly covered in your book post. I said that I wanted to talk about, and so the album that you picked was Dag Nasty, Can I Say? I think it was Instagram. You posted something earlier, and you included a copy of Travis Barker's autobiography.
Yes.
And which I was like, great, because as soon as I hear the name Can I Say, obviously all I can picture is Travis Barker and his tattoo that says Can I Say. Mm-hmm. Does that have anything to do with this record?
I believe it does. Yeah. I don't recall though that Travis talks very much about Dag Nasty. It's just like the Can I Say is from the Can I Say record. And also there was a CD liner notes for a soundtrack for a Taylor Steele movie called The Show. Right. And it's because of that soundtrack that's how I got into Dag Nasty, is that No Use for a Name covers I've Heard. And I'd never heard a Dag Nasty song before, but I heard it, and I was like, man, this song is super aggressive, and I really like this. And then when I find out that it's a Dag Nasty song, and I heard that the band Horace Pinker had covered 1 to 2, I was like, well, I should check out Can I Say? And, Can I Say is one of those records that I keep coming back to because of the fact that there's maturity to it, but still like angry, youthful kind of thing. Right. And I mean, like, going to go back with the hot sports opinions here, but I can't remember the last time I wanted to listen to a Minor Threat song, but I can remember when I wanted to listen to a Dag Nasty song. And there's just a lot of things about it, and like the two songs that I really wanted to highlight with you were Values Here and I've Heard. Both of those songs to me like really show that like Dave Smalley is an incredible singer, and that Brian Baker, that guy's a guitar prodigy. He jammed with Santana when he was really young. And, I kind of forget, oh, yeah, he played bass in Minor Threat and later guitar and then back on bass. And, oh, yeah, and he was heavily influenced by AC/DC, and he really wanted this kick-ass sort of guitar sort of playing in the next main band he did after Minor Threat broke up, and he played in the Meatmen and Samhain. And so, yeah, it's like, and Colin Sears' drumming, just fantastic. And I highly, highly recommend checking out Can I Say if you've never really if you like Rites of Spring, if you like Embrace, and I'm talking the DC band, not the British band, but like, Can I Say, solid 10 song, 25-minute record to listen to. So,
well, and it's interesting that you brought up. I mean, it's not interesting. It's not unexpected that you brought up Minor Threat in a sense, because obviously coming from the same scene and whatnot, and obviously Ian Mackay producing this and Brian Baker being in the band, and but the first note, because like Dag Nasty is a band that I never had listened to prior. I'd heard the name, and obviously in reading the different books they'd come up, and for whatever reason, as far as I can remember, I recognized the artwork, so maybe I did listen at some point, but this was the first time I really kind of dug in, and my initial kind of reaction to it was, it reminds me of Minor Threat, except it's way more melodic. Obviously with Dave Smalley's vocals, he's like Ian Mackay in Minor Threat just does a lot more yelling and like talking almost, versus Dave Smalley here, where there's legit parts where he's actually singing melodies, and it really kind of takes it to another level. In fact, the song that I brought up, like that I wanted to mention, was the song Circles. Part of it was, I don't know if it's Smalley singing or not, but on the bridge, the background vocals that are going on there actually like remind me of the Smiths, and it's just sort of like this, kind of a bit, it's hardcore punk, and it's emotional hardcore, it's post, whatever you want to call it, and it's also super melodic at the same time. So I thoroughly kind of enjoyed it. And you'd mentioned like the whole, there's a maturity to it, but also like this kind of just like young energy that's kind of going on there. And I don't know, man, like, so how did you first kind of heard about it because of the cover. Was it sort of like immediately, like where does it kind of rank, I guess, for you, as far, you don't have to put a number on this, but is it on its own up there pretty high for kind of like your favorite records type thing, or is it more that I told you had to pick something from this book?
I mean, as far as like in this kind of niche, this is one of my favorite records, but as far as for me, like the pantheon of my all-time favorite records, that belongs to albums that are very not post-hardcore, but other than Jimmy Eat World's Clarity, Face to Face's Don't Turn Away, the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, the first, it's such a toss-up for me, but the first two Ben Folds 5 records, Sunny Real Estate's Diary, but like but it's like Can I Say is a great record to always revisit. And I would put it like this. It's like there are a lot of sentiments in that record that you don't have to be 15 years old to be like, yeah, that's me. I mean, I remember interviewing Brian Baker for the book, and I told him about how, like, because like Brian wrote the majority of the lyrics on that record, about how like I can relate to this, as at the time I was in my 20s. And how it's like a lot of these things that first Sean Brown and then later Dave Smalley sang are things that don't necessarily go away as you get into adulthood. And Brian's like, dude, I'm still struggling with a lot of the stuff I wrote the lyrics for on Can I Say? And I was like, okay, all right, and so like that to me is like a great example of how like music can travel with you through your life. Trevor Keith is one of my all-time favorite like singers and lyricists, and what he sings about, you can be 15 years old, 25, 35, and now at 41, you can get something out of it instead of like, oh yeah, I was like really upset about like animal testing when I was 17 years old, so I was all about Earth Crisis then, but now it's like, you can't fight every war. So in other words, like, that's my point. It's like, Can I Say? It's like there are so many sentiments on it that you can keep coming back to. Like just the line, "I've heard this, I've heard that. What do I believe?"
Yeah. It's funny, like the Trevor Keith thing, because we did an episode on Face to Face a while back, and we plan on actually doing kind of like in the future a deeper dive, because we had sort of a bit of a background, if you haven't heard it, when we started, we kind of did like episodes focused solely on a band, and we try to cover like their entire discography. And we very quickly found out, man, that's an undertaking for some bands.
Yeah.
And so we then decided to like, well, let's just break it down and do 2 records per show type thing. And so Face to Face, we plan on doing a deeper dive. But one of the things about Trevor Keith and Face to Face, and like same way for me, is like Face to Face is easily one of my favorite, just like straight up punk bands. And a lot of it is Trevor's lyrics, in the fact that I was trying to figure it out, because I can still connect to them, like you said, like as much today as I did when I was 17 years old. And I think a lot of that, though, is that his lyrics are often, they're kind of vague but not vague, right? Like you said, like, you know, an Earth Crisis song, or when you talked about like the animal rights sort of thing, like my initial thought went to Good Riddance, and how, you know, they've definitely got some songs that are very much, you know, against, you know, animal cruelty and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And like, so those are very, like, they're very obvious what those are about. Whereas with Face to Face, a lot of it is just like that, you know, it can be introspective. It can also be, you know, just kind of a broad look at how things are going. You can apply it to so many things. Right. And that can, I mean, there might be some instances where for lyricists, I might be like, that's a weakness of theirs. But with Trevor Keith, I think just the way he does it is just like, no, he kind of like paints a broad picture, but also does it in a way that is still it doesn't feel like he's singing about nothing, if that makes sense, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, and yeah, I mean, I can see that kind of comparison with this record here, in just like, and I can also see, you know, when I think of going back to Toby Morris and H2O, I can also, like, you know, I was thinking about how his lyrics, he's another lyricist where he can get very specific with some things, but at the same point, he's always writing things that, you know, whether I was 17 years old or 35 years old, I can still kind of make that same connection, because he's just singing about everyday things. And I saw a lot of that on this record here.
Yeah. When all throughout my 20s, I kept reminding myself of the Toby Morse line of, I've come too far now to ever close my eyes, because like, I was really trying to navigate where the hell am I going to go with my life. And I was just like, well, just keep going down the path that makes you happy. And so, yeah, and I think a lot of that stems from his influence of Washington, D.C. post-hardcore.
Totally. Yeah, totally. Yeah, man, this was a ton of fun.
Yeah, man.
I also like the opportunity to, you know, kind of discover some, like, so this is another band that I was familiar with the name, but as I mentioned, I never really dug into. So it's always fun to kind of hear from other people, like albums that, you know, kind of held something for them that maybe I had never really listened to. So I can definitely say that Dag Nasty is I actually went on Discord's website earlier today. I was like, can I get this on vinyl? Is it still available on vinyl? But they're out of print right now. So I was like, damn it.
Hopefully it'll be back in print soon, you know, because they do a pretty good job of keeping everything in print in some form or fashion.
There you go. But man, yeah, I guess, do you want to share like your social media stuff if people want to follow you and you know, kind of keep up to date with how the book's coming along?
Yeah, you know, you can find me on Facebook, just as long as, you know, you're cool and you don't want to send me hate mail or anything, you know, you can easily find me. But as far as like Twitter and Instagram, I am ERIC_GRUBBS on Twitter, and on Instagram, I'm Eric J. Grubbs. The J is in James.
Hey, same middle name. Here we go. We're officially. I've been bugging you because you were posting about the Kevin Smith stuff and all. I was like, man, we're gonna have to start separate podcasts here, and then we also share the same middle name. So there we go. It's
right. Yeah, so you can find me on there. You know, it's just like I like to interact with people that, you know, people like yourself, that it's like, hey, we want to have discussions about it, and I'm always happy to answer any question that people have. Yeah. It's just like we all got to like look out for each other, because like, you know, when it comes to like people that say grew up on punk, it's like you kind of know when you meet people. Like when you posted about Slick Shoes, I'm like, oh yeah. Yeah. You know, because it's like, you know, it's it sounds like kind of snobby, but I think of it like this. It's like if you meet people that say we're like big fans of Slick Shoes, and even if they haven't listened to Slick Shoes in like 20 years, chances are those people have like fond memories, and I'd like to, talk to people about that kind of stuff. So
Yeah, man. That one surprised me when you commented about, I'd posted about Slick Shoes, and then so you were like deep diving back into them. I was like, all right, here we go. You just never know sometimes, because like, so for like Aaron, my co-host, and myself, we both kind of grew up with a lot of it. Obviously I mentioned MXPX earlier, but kind of like getting those foot in the door with, like punk, skate punk, pop punk sort of stuff, kind of through like the tooth and nail Christian side of things.
Yeah, me too.
So sometimes it's surprising how far they reach sometimes, like some of those bands that, I think like, well, I know who they are, but do other people? Like, so that's pretty awesome.
Craig's brother.
Yeah. There you go, man.
Yeah, Homecoming. That was my jam,
Yeah, that is a good record.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's going to do it for this episode. So,
Cool.
Goodbye.
I was only pointing out that you weren't paying any attention to what I was saying.
I hope it feels good.
You hope what feels good?
I hope it feels so good to be right. There's nothing more exhilarating than pointing out the shortcomings of others, is there?
Well, this is the last time I rent here.
You'll be missed.
Screw you!
Hey, you're not allowed to rent here anymore. Yeah!